She boiled leather to keep their bellies full. He rode past the smoke thinking it was just another poor soul burning kindling. But when he saw the children scraping broth from boots, he couldn't keep riding. The kettle hissed again, not from the water boiling inside, but from the weight of silence pressing against the walls of the shack. Martha Bray sat still before it, shoulders hunched and eyes glassed over, one hand gripping a long wooden spoon that had more cracks than use left in it. The leather strap in the pot floated limp, turning the water a thin gray that pretended to be broth. The smell was a mixture of smoke and shame. Her children sat behind her, quiet as ash. 10-year-old Henry clutched his little brother Caleb tighter than he ever had, wrapping one arm around the boy's thin chest while the other hovered protectively near Ruth, the youngest at 5. None of them spoke, not anymore. Talking took hope, and they'd run dry of that long before the snow started falling. Martha stirred slowly. The spoon scraped the bottom with a dull sound like dragging a bone across stone. She'd torn the tongue from her dead husband's work boot last night, scraping off the mold, soaking it for hours. There were no more roots to dig, no more oats to grind. The barn had caved in last spring. The chickens had gone feral. She buried the last one a month ago after Henry found it dead, half-eaten by something meaner than hunger. She hadn't meant to burn the last sack of flour. She'd only turned her back for a second. Ruth had started coughing again and she'd panicked, knocking over the pot. The ashes still lined the hearth, a ghost of what could have fed them 2 more days. Since then, every morning was another walk to the empty pantry, every evening another prayer that somehow bread might just show up. She ladled 3 spoonfuls of the gray liquid into chipped tin mugs, handing them to the children without a word. Henry nodded once before sipping. Caleb hesitated, his lip trembling, then drank without complaint. Ruth sniffled, curling into her brother's side as she sipped. Martha took none for herself. There wasn't enough to pretend tonight. Outside, the sky bruised deeper, casting the fields in a sorrowed blue. There hadn't been visitors in months, not since the last tax collector showed up and left with a broken wagon axle. Nobody came this far east unless they were lost, running from something, or too proud to turn around. And that's when they heard the hooves. Slow, steady, a trot that didn't rush or hesitate. Henry froze, his fingers wrapping tighter around the mug. Caleb's eyes widened, and Ruth let out a soft squeak that Martha silenced with a glance. The kettle hissed again. Then a knock. 3 times, firm, not angry, then nothing. Martha stood. Her knees cracked as she pushed herself upright, heart hammering hard enough to blur her vision. She didn't grab the rifle. It hadn't fired in years, and the last time she tried to oil it, the barrel rusted through. Instead, she wiped her palms on her apron, walked to the door, and opened it. The man outside didn't speak, he just looked. He was tall, the kind of tall that filled a doorway and made a woman square her shoulders. His coat was thick, wool layered with dust and travel stains. His beard was silver at the edge, but the eyes, gray and pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat, were younger than the rest of him. He smelled of horses, pine, and distance. His saddlebag rested against one hip, and slung across his back was a wrapped parcel Martha couldn't place. "I'm not selling," she said before he could speak. He didn't smile, wasn't buying. She waited, so did he. "Lost?" she asked, voice rough. He shook his head. "I saw the smoke." "You rode over cause of smoke." Her tone was flat. He nodded, didn't expect to see boots boiling. Martha's jaw clenched. "You can move along now." "I could," he said, "but I won't." She narrowed her eyes. "Why not?" The man glanced past her shoulder, not rudely, just enough to spot the children sitting near the hearth. You alone? He asked. Martha lifted her chin. You see anyone else here? I see 3 kids, and a woman too proud to ask for help. Something in her cracked right then, but she didn't let it show. Not fully. You think you can fix this with a few loaves of bread and a warm voice? No, ma'am, he said, but I can start with that. The wind shifted behind him. He stepped forward, slow like a man approaching a spooked animal. From the satchel he pulled a wrapped bundle. She recognized the smell before she saw it, smokehouse-cured ham. Not fresh, but real meat. Beside it, a bundle of dried apples, 2 loaves of hard bread, and a jar of pickled beans. I didn't come here to pity you, he said. I came 'cause I remember what starving looked like. My name's Thad Cooper. Got a place west of here, past Hollow Creek. Been keeping to myself since the fever took my wife. Martha didn't speak, couldn't. I can go, he said finally, but it'd sit heavy on me if I did. He didn't offer the bundle again, just set it on the step, tipped his hat, and turned. Wait, she said. He stopped mid-step. You come inside, Martha said, just for supper. He turned back, nodded once, and followed her in. Caleb stared wide-eyed as Thad entered, his gaze never leaving the stranger. Ruth tucked herself deeper behind Henry. Martha moved back to the pot, dumped the gray water into the ashes, and wiped the kettle with a rag. Her hands shook as she opened the ham, slicing it thin with a blade she hadn't sharpened in months. It wasn't much, but it was something. Thad sat on a stool by the fire, quiet, watchful, like a man familiar with silence and grief. He didn't press, didn't ask, just helped when she handed him a mug and spoke soft when Ruth dropped hers and burst into tears. It's all right, little one, he said. Ain't nothing broken can't be fixed. Martha looked up sharply at that. It wasn't the words, it was the way he said them, like he wasn't just talking about tinware. That night, after the children slept deeper than they had in weeks, she asked him why he was riding east alone. He answered with 6 words. I was hungry too, just different. Morning came without light, just a dim lifting of blackness, enough to show the snow had fallen again, soft and thick, muffling the world like a wool blanket drawn over a coffin. Martha stirred before the sun, her hands already reaching for the kettle before her eyes opened. The fire had burned low, but it hadn't died. That alone felt like a kind of miracle. She leaned forward, fed it with dry splinters, and watched the orange glow rise slowly from the ashes like something reborn. Thad Cooper hadn't left. She knew it before she turned her head. He was still there, half upright in the old rocking chair, arms crossed over his chest, hat pulled low. He hadn't taken off his coat all night. He slept like a man who didn't trust peace, who expected the knock of trouble at any hour. But his breathing was even, and his presence filled the room like the warmth of a banked stove. Quiet, steady, unspoken. Martha didn't wake him. She moved about the kitchen with the quiet rhythm of survival: water, fire, pan, slice, stir. She made a thin porridge from the hard bread he'd brought, softened with milk from the last tin can she'd been saving for a worse day. Today had earned it. By the time the children began to stir, blinking sleep from their eyes, the scent of real food drifted through the shack like a balm. Ruth was the first to rise, her small fingers rubbing at her eyes before she looked toward the hearth and saw the pan. Her lips parted slightly, disbelief sharpening her gaze. Ma, she whispered. Martha nodded. It's hot, be careful. Caleb didn't wait for permission. He scrambled toward the low table, sliding into place with the urgent clumsiness of a boy who didn't know if this was real or a dream he'd soon lose. Henry moved slower, older in ways he shouldn't have been. his eyes drifting to the stranger still asleep in the corner. "He's still here," he said quietly. Martha nodded again. "He brought the food. His name's Thad." Henry didn't answer, but his shoulders relaxed a little. Trust didn't come easy in these parts, and less still to boys who'd had to grow up fast. Thad stirred as the children ate, one eye opening beneath the brim of his hat. He didn't speak right away, just watched them for a moment, the corner of his mouth twitching slightly when Ruth offered him the first spoonful from her own bowl. "I can't eat all this," she said solemnly. "You take some, mister." He sat upright, stretched, and took the spoon with a nod so gentle it made Martha look away. They ate in silence, broken only by the soft scrape of spoons and the occasional hum of Caleb's approval. It was the best breakfast they'd had in months, not because it was rich or heavy, but because it was real. It was enough. When the bowls were scraped clean, Thad stood and pulled a tin flask from his coat. "I'll fetch more wood," he said. "That pile out back won't last 2 more nights." "You don't have to," Martha began, but he was already slipping out the door. The wind slapped him as he stepped outside, but he didn't flinch. Snow coated everything in a sheen of silence, and the sky above was a pale stretch of grief-colored gray. He moved like a man used to labor, cutting through the drift and heading toward the tree line beyond the sagging barn. The axe sat untouched near the woodpile, rust flecking its handle. He picked it up, tested the weight, and began to chop. Inside, Martha watched him through the window, fingers twisting the frayed edge of her apron. She wasn't used to men doing anything for her without wanting something in return. Since Thomas died, the world had made it clear that pity came with strings, and charity was just cruelty with a sugar coating. But Thad didn't look like a man expecting repayment. He looked like someone trying to feel useful again. "You think he's an angel?" Ruth asked suddenly, voice barely a whisper. Martha turned. Ruth was seated cross-legged on the floor, her doll cradled in her lap. She looked up at her mother, eyes wide and solemn. "Like from the Bible," the little girl added. "One of the ones that come help folks when they're crying too much." Martha didn't smile, not really, but something in her expression softened. "No," she said quietly, "he's not an angel, just a man. But he brought food." "I know. And he chopped wood." "I know, baby." Ruth tilted her head. "So why's he sad too?" Martha didn't answer that, because she didn't know. By noon, the house was warmer than it had been in weeks. The fire crackled bright, and a stew simmered slowly from the last of the beans and a few strips of ham. The children played quietly, a strange calm wrapped around them. Caleb and Henry built towers from scraps of firewood, and Ruth sang to her doll in a tuneless murmur that carried like a prayer. Thad came in covered in snowdust, his cheeks red, hair damp beneath his hat. He nodded at Martha as he set down a fresh stack of wood by the door. "You got animals?" he asked. Martha hesitated. "Not anymore. Barn's caved." "I know. You want it fixed." She blinked. "You fix barns too." He shrugged. "I fix what's broken." She looked at him then, not like a woman assessing a stranger, but like someone trying to figure out what made a man like him walk into a starving home and start rebuilding it from the inside out. "Why?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. It was yellowed, soft at the edges, creased 100 times over. He laid it on the table and stepped back. Martha approached slowly, eyes narrowing as she unfolded it. It was a drawing, rough but careful, a house, Children, a woman on the porch, not a masterpiece but full of love, lines drawn like memories. There were names scrawled beneath: Clara, Martin, Jonah, and beneath that in softer pencil, Thad's dreams. Martha stared at it for a long time. "They gone?" she asked finally. Thad nodded once. "Fever," she guessed. "No fire." Her hand went to her mouth. He didn't say more. He didn't have to. "You think you can build it again?" she asked. Thad looked at her then, really looked. "No," he said, "but I can build something." The afternoon passed with a quiet that felt less like absence and more like peace. Thad worked on the barn, hammering, sawing, shoring up beams. Henry asked to help, and Thad showed him how to brace a wall. Caleb followed with nails in a tin cup. Ruth carried scraps to the fire and offered songs for each one. Martha stood at the edge of the porch, apron dusted with flour, heart suddenly full of something terrifying: hope. That night, after the children were asleep again, she handed Thad a blanket. "You can stay," she said, "just for a little while until the barn's done." He didn't move to take the blanket. Instead, he looked at her, really looked, and said, "You remind me of her." She froze. "Not in the way you look," he continued, "but the way you don't fall, even when everything's gone." Martha swallowed hard. "I ain't her," she said softly. "I know. I don't need saving. I know that too." She handed him the blanket. Their hands brushed. Neither said anything else that night. But when the wind howled outside and the snow danced in swirls, it found nothing left to take. The sun broke late. It rose like a bruised coin behind layers of cloud and ice, casting more shadow than light, but it came just the same. Martha didn't wake to the sound of children fussing, or the groan of the roof shifting under frost, or even the crackle of the hearth needing feeding. She woke to a smell: fresh wood, pine sap, and something warmer. Thad had started cooking. She rose, more out of curiosity than necessity, and stepped into the kitchen with her shawl still around her shoulders, feet bare on the creaking boards. He stood over the small stove with sleeves rolled up, stirring a skillet that hissed and popped with wild onion, egg, and the smallest pieces of ham. The children sat watching like he was working a miracle. "You can cook?" she asked, sleep rough in her voice. Thad didn't turn. Lived alone too long not to. "You had eggs." "Hen in the barn," he said without missing a beat. Found her under the rubble, brooding over one last clutch like she thought she'd bring spring back single-beaked. "Reckon we owe her breakfast for a week." Martha blinked. She hadn't been in the barn since the roof collapsed last winter. Just hadn't had it in her, not to bury what they'd lost. Not again. She took the stool beside Ruth, brushing a hand down her daughter's hair. The girl leaned into her, cheeks warm, mouth full. "Is it real?" Ruth whispered. Martha nodded. "It is today." They ate slow, savoring every bite like it had cost them something dear because it had. Hunger made gluttony impossible. Gratitude left no room for haste. Thad didn't speak much, but he poured coffee for Martha, offered seconds to Caleb, and scraped the pan clean without prompting. He wasn't a guest anymore. He moved through the house like he belonged there. Later, while the children played, Martha followed him back out to the barn. The snow had crusted over in the night, thick enough to crunch beneath her boots. The wind had died down, but it still pressed sharp fingers beneath her shawl. The barn wasn't fixed, but it wasn't falling anymore either. Thad had lifted the collapsed beams, reset 3 support posts, and cleared the rot from one wall. It still sagged in places, but it stood. Martha stared at it for a long time, arms crossed. "I thought it was done for," she said finally. "So did I," Thad replied. "Turns out, some things just need someone to believe in 'em again." She looked at him sideways, but he wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't even smiling, just speaking plain. There was a rustling inside. Martha stepped through the crooked door and froze. The old stall, Thomas's stall, once, was now cleaned out, fresh hay laid across the floor. And in the corner, in a crate softened with rags and burlap, lay a hen and 3 fluffy chicks, blinking up at her like they'd been there all along. "You fixed this much overnight?" she asked. "I didn't sleep much." She opened her mouth to say something else, but it caught in her throat. There was too much in the air, not just gratitude but memory. Her husband had died out here, right in that stall, kicked in the chest by a mule too spooked to be blamed. He hadn't cried out. He hadn't had time. Just crumpled, breathless bones breaking like matchsticks. That was the last place Martha had ever spoken to God in full voice. She begged that night, begged for him to bring Thomas back, or at least leave her the strength to carry what was left. She hadn't prayed much since. "I can finish it today," Thad said gently behind her, "if you want." She nodded but didn't trust her voice to answer. She walked out slow. By noon the sky was clearer, and Caleb had convinced Thad to let him try the hammer. Henry watched, quietly protective, while Ruth offered advice that made no sense but was too sincere to interrupt. The barn groaned and shifted under the weight of its own return to usefulness, and the house felt lighter for it. Martha cleaned more that day than she had in weeks, not because the place needed it, but because her hands had forgotten how to rest. Thad didn't leave at dusk. He didn't even pretend to. He sat with them through dinner, which was nothing more than boiled potatoes and fried onion, but it fed everyone just the same. Afterward, he helped Caleb mend a broken stool leg, read a psalm out loud while Ruth braided his sleeve with bits of string, and taught Henry how to wrap a busted wrist using strips of muslin and patience. When the children fell asleep, one by one, curled in their quilts, Thad moved to the porch. Martha joined him minutes later. They didn't speak. Winter didn't leave quickly. It never did. It lingered like grief, some days light, some days unbearable, but never truly gone. Still, each morning brought a small sign, a drip from the eaves, a crow overhead, the scent of thaw in the frozen ground. Martha noticed the change because she had to, and because now she wasn't noticing it alone. The work was no lighter, but the burden felt shared. Thad became a fixture. He didn't ask to stay. He didn't need to. He earned it without ceremony. Every day began before sunrise, every chore taken on without remark. He tended the woodpile, rebuilt the lean-to near the well, repaired the door to the chicken coop, and fixed the cracked water pump that Martha had given up on months ago. Not once did he act like he was doing favors. He worked like a man paying off a debt, though he never said to whom. And the children, Lord, the children. They took to him like spring to rain. Ruth shadowed him everywhere, her eyes wide, soaking in each tool he touched, every word he offered. Caleb followed suit, quieter but no less curious. Henry stayed reserved, protective of his mother and watchful in a way that betrayed a wisdom too old for his years. But even he softened. He'd never had a father figure who stayed, not really. And Thad didn't flinch from his suspicion. He earned him too, day by day, with silence, respect, and steady hands. One morning, Ruth tugged on Martha's sleeve while they washed linens at the creek's edge. "Do you think God sent him?" Martha's hands stilled in the icy water. She stared at the sheet in her grasp, the memory of Thomas ghosting across her knuckles. "I don't know," she said after a while, "but maybe." "Do you think he'll leave when it gets warm?" The question stung, though she'd asked herself the same. "I think," Martha said, folding the damp cloth, "we should be grateful for today first." That night after the children had gone to sleep, Thad stayed on the porch longer than usual. Martha joined him. The moon was high, casting silver over everything, softened the barn, lit the frozen ruts of the path, gilded the broken places as if even they deserved beauty. She handed him a cup of coffee, the last of the real beans she'd hidden in the cabinet. Neither of them spoke for a while. "I think they're starting to forget," Thad said finally. Martha looked up. "Your children, what hunger felt like, what it meant to boil a boot." She swallowed hard. "They'll remember when I do." "You don't have to carry that guilt, Martha." "Don't I?" He turned, facing her in the pale light. "No one blames you for surviving, least of all them." She almost laughed. "You speak like you know what it costs." He didn't smile. "Because I do." Then silence again, that kind that speaks louder than words. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, the way his eyes stayed on the road even when there was nothing to see. "I buried 3 graves on this land," she said quietly. "One for Thomas, one for the baby I lost before Ruth, and one I dug for myself the night I realized I had no more tears to cry." Thad didn't flinch. "Why are you still here?" she whispered. "You've done your share, you don't owe us anything." He looked down at his boots, then back at her. "You don't fix barns and leave the family inside to rot." Martha didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she nodded once, turned, and walked back inside before her face betrayed her. The thaw came faster after that. By the 3rd week of March, the snow melted into hungry earth, and the stream behind the house flowed fast enough to be heard from the porch. The chickens laid again, and the goat Martha had long stopped milking surprised her one morning with a low bleat and swollen udder. Thad smiled when he saw the pail full of milk. "Told you she just needed a reason." He turned his attention to the pasture. The fence was sagging in the southern corner, and the shed had half its roof torn off. He worked without asking, same as always. Henry helped, and even Ruth dragged scraps of lumber from the woodpile to be planed and measured. It felt like building something more than a fence. It felt like building a life again. Then came the wagon. It rolled in slow, dust trailing behind it like a bad omen. Caleb was the first to see it, standing near the barn with a piece of rope looped around his hands. He ran back shouting. Martha and Thad stepped out together. She felt it before she saw it, some old tremor that lived in her ribs now, a twitch in the air that whispered, "Trouble." The wagon stopped 20 paces from the house. 2 men sat up front, hats low over their eyes, guns visible at their sides but untouched. Behind them, the wagon bed was covered in tarp, but she could see movement underneath. Thad's hand rested on the butt of his revolver. He hadn't worn it much around the house, but today he had it on. One of the men stood and called out, looking for a man named Thaddeus Crane. Thad didn't blink. "You found him." "You got something of ours," the man replied. "Come to take it back." Martha's heart dropped. Thad stepped forward. "Speak plain." The man gestured toward the wagon. "One of those girls you helped, she was promised to someone, took off before he could collect. He's angry, paid good money for her." Martha moved closer to the children. "I don't own anyone," Thad said flatly. "And if she's here, she stays because she wants to." The man laughed once, dry and mean. "That ain't how it works, Mr. Crane. That's not how this territory runs." Martha stepped forward. "This is our land. You'll leave it now." The man's eyes narrowed. "We'll be back, and we won't be knocking next time." Then the wagon turned and disappeared down the trail, dust thick behind it. Thad stood frozen a while after they'd gone. Martha moved to him, saw the twitch in his jaw, the old fire flickering in his eyes. "I didn't know," she said softly, "that you'd been helping others, that someone might come for you. I didn't think they'd follow me this far. Do we need to run?" He shook his head. "Not yet, but I'll be ready." That night he dug up a rifle from behind the barn, polished it, checked every round. Then he sat outside the children's bedroom door until sunrise. And Martha, though afraid, didn't feel alone. She stayed up too, sitting by the hearth with coffee gone cold, staring into the orange embers, whispering one last prayer she hadn't dared voice in years. Not for safety, not for rescue, but for strength. The rains came early that April, soaking the land like heaven had finally wept for all it had ignored in the winter. It didn't bring softness, not right away. Mud thickened, roads turned to slush, and the roof leaked again despite Thad's careful patching. But it brought cover, a kind of hush that kept wagons away and footsteps masked. Martha found herself waking every day in the same breathless rhythm, listening for hooves, then wind, then silence. When it was silence, she let herself breathe. Thad worked longer days now, rising before light, often coming in well past dusk. Not for money, not for pride, for readiness. He was bracing them, Martha knew, fortifying the corners of their lives in case the trouble returned. He taught Henry to shoot, quietly and carefully, out behind the barn where no eyes could spy. He showed Ruth how to run the trap line and sharpen the small knives. He taught Caleb the signs of a man lying through his teeth and the worth of listening twice before speaking once. He did not treat them like soldiers. He treated them like they mattered. Martha couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at her children and seen not burdens or ghosts of their dead father, but people worth preparing for the world. She watched the change bloom in them, even as the shadows loomed closer. One afternoon, Ruth brought in a letter. It had no name on it, just "To the house with the broken boot on the porch." The boot had been there since the winter thaw, Caleb's old pair, nailed to the rail after it split for good. They'd left it because it made them laugh. Martha opened the envelope with a knife. The paper inside was thick and the ink stiff. "Mr. Crane, you were warned. The man who bought her is owed satisfaction. You have until the full moon to return what's his. After that, we collect in blood." It was unsigned. Martha read it 3 times, then handed it to Thad without a word. He didn't react right away, just stared at the page until Ruth, watching from the table, whispered, "What's it say?" Martha opened her mouth, but Thad beat her to it. "It says they're cowards." Then he folded the letter, tucked it into the fire, and watched it burn. That night he sat at the edge of the children's beds again. Martha didn't ask him to. She didn't have to. He carved a little more every night now, whittling rough shapes into clean ones by firelight, pieces of wood from the trees he'd felled himself. Caleb asked if they were toys. Ruth guessed animals, but Martha knew better. They were markers, pieces to place down when it was time to remember who fought for whom. At breakfast the next morning, Henry asked the question they'd all been avoiding. "Why are they after you, Mr. Thad?" Thad sipped his coffee. Then he said quietly, "Because I helped someone walk away." "From who?" "From someone who paid to own her." Henry frowned. "That's wrong." "Yes," Thad said, "it is. And now they want to hurt you for it. They want to scare me, to make me think I did wrong." Henry looked at his mother. "But you helped her, right? You didn't take her." Thad nodded. She was 14, locked in a barn and traded like cattle. I opened the door. Ruth's hand curled around her cup. Was it her, the one in the wagon? Yes. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The children fell silent after that. They didn't ask more, but something in them shifted, an understanding deeper than what most adults could carry. They weren't just caught in some man's revenge anymore. They were part of something bigger. And so they watched the windows a little closer, learned to close the shutters without being told, took turns walking the goats and checking the traps and feeding the hens, not out of fear, out of loyalty. A week later, on a morning washed clean by rain, Martha found a bundle on the porch. No knock, no hoofbeats, just a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. Inside, a dead rabbit, its throat cut clean, and a note pinned to the fur. Next time it won't be an animal. She brought it inside without a word. Thad didn't need to read it. He saw her face. They've been watching us, she said. Likely since the letter, he replied, testing our fear. She met his gaze. And are we afraid? He didn't answer right away. Then, I'm afraid I waited too long to build walls. That night Thad took the children to the barn. He laid out rifles, showed them the tools he'd stored beneath the floorboards, and taught them to load without flinching. Even Ruth, especially Ruth. Martha watched from the hayloft steps, her hands pressed together, not in horror but in awe. He wasn't preparing them to fight. He was preparing them to survive. A few days later, the sky darkened, not with storm but with quiet. The animals were restless. The birds disappeared. Thad stood by the gate long after sunset, the moon swelling in the east like an open eye. They'll come tonight, he said simply. Martha didn't ask how he knew. Some truths didn't need confirming. They barred the doors, doused the lamps. The children lay beneath the beds, blankets pulled close, rifles beside them. Martha stood at the hearth, a shotgun in her grip, her dress torn at the sleeve from rushing to shutter the coop. Thad stood near the front window, the rifle already cradled against his chest. When the knock came, it wasn't timid. It was a fist. Boom. 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 Thad didn't move. Martha took a step forward, but he stopped her with one word. No. Then he opened the door. A man stood there, taller than most, his face cloaked in shadow, his mouth curled into something just short of a grin. Behind him, two others held torches. One had an axe, the other a whip. The leader tipped his hat. Mr. Crane. Thad stared at him. You came. Moon's full. Is that how you mark your crimes? Lunar cycles. The man grinned wider. I'm not here for philosophy. I'm here for property. She's not here. Then someone's lying. Thad didn't blink. You get one chance to leave without blood. The man glanced past him. You've got a widow behind you, a few runts. I've got men, fire, steel. What do you think happens next? Thad stepped onto the porch. The man raised his brow. You sure? I've made peace with God, Thad said. You haven't. A long pause. Then everything happened at once. The man raised his hand. Thad fired. The rifle's crack shattered the quiet. The leader jerked back, collapsing into the mud with a curse. One of the men ran. The other charged. Martha fired second. The man with the whip never made it to the steps. He dropped where he stood, blood blooming across his chest like spilled ink. Thad stepped forward, chambered another round, but the third man was already gone, vanished into the trees. The yard went still. The moon gleamed like judgment above them. Martha lowered the shotgun. Her hands were shaking, but her aim had been true. Thad stared at the bodies, then at her. "You ever shot before?" She nodded once. "When I lost Thomas, I practiced." The children didn't come out until morning. They buried the bodies at the edge of the woods. No markers, no prayers, just dirt and silence. Thad didn't speak of it again. Neither did Martha. But that night he built a new fence, not around the pasture, around the house. And when the children went to bed and the fire had burned low, Martha sat beside him on the porch and laid her hand over his. He didn't pull away. The fence wasn't just wood. It was a line in the earth, a border made not of pine and nail but of memory, of everything they'd survived and everything they refused to surrender again. It circled the house like a halo made of timber, and though it stood only 6 feet high, it held back the world. Thad worked on it every day after the attack, rain or sun. He didn't speak much while building, just measured, sawed, nailed. He taught Henry to check the posts for rot, taught Caleb how to mend weak hinges, and Ruth how to run wire along the top. There were no more lessons about crops or cattle. Now it was traps and smoke signals and how to sleep with one ear open. Even the goats sensed the change. They bleated less, moved slower, watched the shadows longer. The chickens stopped laying for 3 days straight. Martha didn't ask Thad how he was sleeping. She could see it in his face, how it aged with every dawn, but he never slowed, never faltered. He carved new wooden slats in the evenings with hands that looked more like stone than flesh. Still, he was gentle when one of the children fell asleep against him. When Ruth curled into his coat during a thunderstorm, he held her without needing to be asked. A week passed, then 2. No more letters came, no more threats. The grave at the tree line settled, covered in moss and silence. And yet, Martha could feel it, an unease not born from danger, but from waiting, like holding a scream in the back of your throat for too long, like knowing the storm wasn't over, only circling. Then one morning, Caleb didn't come back from the creek. He'd gone to check the crawfish trap, same as always. He never strayed far. But this time the sun passed its peak and there was no sign of him. Martha tried to stay calm. He might have slipped, twisted something. Thad was already grabbing his rifle. They found the trap overturned, the bucket gone. Footprints circled the bank, too large to be Caleb's, too deep to be fresh. A patch of shirt fabric hung from a thorn bush nearby. Martha dropped to her knees and stared at the torn cloth. Thad's jaw clenched. They didn't kill him, not yet. How do you know? Because if they had, they'd have left him. This, he pointed at the cloth, this is bait. They want us to come. But why Caleb, why not? They know children are harder to defend and easier to break. He didn't say what he meant by that, but Martha felt the sickness bloom in her gut. They returned home and found a fresh letter nailed to the barn door. The paper was wet, the ink smudged, but the words still cut clean. You owe, we collect, come alone, sundown, barn at Widow's Hollow. Martha had only heard of that place once, in a story told by men too drunk to lie properly. It was a stretch of dead field north of town, abandoned after the fever took 3 families in 1 month. The barn still stood, they said, half collapsed, but cursed enough to keep scavengers away. Folks used it to do the kind of trades that never made it to daylight. Thad read the letter twice, then he burned it. I'm going. No, Martha said, we both are. Thad didn't answer at first. Then he looked at her long and low and said, you have 3 children to protect. And 1 to rescue. He didn't argue again. They left the other children with a neighbor Martha trusted, an old widow with a Bible too worn to be anything but honest. They saddled 2 horses, loaded their rifles, and rode out just before sunset. The air was thick with the smell of wet pine and old blood. Birds flew low, and the creek murmured like it was praying. When they reached Widow's Hollow, the sun was a dying fire behind the trees. The barn stood crooked at the far end of the field, its doors open like a mouth too tired to chew. Thad dismounted first, Martha followed. Inside it was quiet, dust hung in the air like smoke, and there at the center of the floor, tied to a post with rope too thick for a child, was Caleb. He wasn't crying. He wasn't moving. "Caleb," Martha rushed forward, but Thad's arm caught her. "Wait." From the shadows, a voice emerged. "I'd hoped you'd come alone, Crane." A man stepped out, broad, scarred, face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Behind him, 2 others, both armed, both smirking. "You heard him?" Thad asked, voice steady. The man laughed. "He's a message and a guarantee. You bring the girl back or we bring your house down." She was a child. She was bought. She was not yours. And now your son isn't yours either, not until you fix it. Martha's hands tightened on her rifle. "Let him go." The man tilted his head. "Or what?" Thad stepped forward. "Or you learn what a man prays for when he has nothing left to lose." A beat. Then everything blurred. The first shot came from Martha. It hit the shoulder of the man to the left, sending him spinning. Thad dropped to a knee, firing twice. One missed, the other didn't. The second guard fell without sound. The leader lunged forward, pulling Caleb upright like a shield. "Drop it, or he dies." Thad didn't lower his gun. "Drop it." Martha's heart slammed against her ribs. Thad's eyes didn't waver. "You shoot him, you lose your trade." The man hesitated. And Caleb moved. The boy twisted, bit the man's hand, ducked low just as Thad pulled the trigger. The man dropped. Silence. Then the boy stood up slowly, blood on his lip, rope still dangling from his wrist. Thad ran to him, pulled him into his arms. Martha collapsed beside them both. "I wasn't scared," Caleb whispered. "I know," Thad said, his voice breaking. They rode home through moonlight and broken prayers. The house had never looked smaller or stronger. Ruth and Henry ran to the porch when they saw them. The old widow waiting in the doorway sobbed quietly, hands clasped to her chest. That night they didn't talk about what happened. They just sat close, ate what little food they had, and held each other like the storm had passed. But Martha knew better. Storms didn't end. They just changed names. The wind had teeth that night. It rattled the shutters and moaned low through the cracks of the cabin walls, searching for something to steal. But inside the Crane home, nothing stirred. Not because they weren't awake, everyone was, but because silence had settled over them like a thick blanket, the kind only fear could weave. Martha sat at the table, hands curled around a cup of lukewarm broth. She hadn't touched it in hours. Thad stood by the window, rifle leaning against the wall within arm's reach, eyes scanning the horizon though there was nothing but blackness. Henry, Ruth, and Caleb had fallen asleep on the floor near the hearth, bundled in blankets, their small bodies pressed close together like saplings bending toward warmth. Only the fire crackled, its embers whispering stories none of them wanted to hear. Martha's fingers trembled, not from cold but from remembering. She kept seeing the barn, the rope, the look in Caleb's eyes. She didn't care that Thad had killed 3 men that night. She didn't care that their blood was still on his boots. All she could think about was how close she had come to losing one of her children, and how easily it could still happen again. "We can't stay," she said finally, her voice quiet barely above the fire's hiss. Thad turned. "Where would we go?" "They know where we are. They came once. They'll come again. We got the fence. We got the creek. We know the land." "They've got desperation, Thad. And when men are desperate, fences don't matter." He didn't argue. That scared her more than anything. They stayed up through the night, both knowing what needed to be said but neither daring to speak it. Not until the first gray light touched the eastern trees did Thad finally sit beside her and say, "We leave at dawn, just us. We go west, get as far from this place as we can." "And the animals, the house?" He shook his head. "Let 'em go. This land's turned. I won't risk another child for dirt." Martha nodded slowly. "We'll pack light." They let the children sleep while they gathered what little they could carry: blankets, food, a few tools, and the family Bible. Thad took his father's hunting knife from its place above the mantel and strapped it to his belt without a word. He filled 2 canteens, double-checked his rifle, then placed his hand on the doorframe one last time like it was a tombstone. By the time the sun had fully risen, they were already past the tree line. 3 days passed. They traveled only at dawn and dusk, sleeping in hollows and beneath rock shelves during the heat of day. The children complained little. Their legs were tired, their feet blistered, but they didn't whimper or beg. Even Ruth, barely 8, walked without asking to be carried. The silence between them was different now, no longer born of grief, but of resolve. On the 4th morning, they reached the ridge. Below, nestled in a shallow valley choked with mist and juniper, was a forgotten mining camp. It looked empty, just a few broken shacks, a rusted water tower, and the collapsed husk of a general store, but it offered shelter. They approached cautiously, weapons drawn, every creak and bird call making them flinch. The camp was quiet, not dead but sleeping. Thad scouted the buildings one by one while Martha kept the children huddled behind a broken fence. When he returned, his eyes were hard. "Place was abandoned a long time ago. Rats more than men, but it'll do for now." They picked the sturdiest shack and began clearing it out. Broken furniture, shattered glass, rusted tools, all tossed aside. Martha found an old stove still bolted to the floor. It took Thad an hour to rig it to burn again, but when he struck the first flame, the warmth felt like a miracle. By the second evening, it felt like they might survive after all. Then came the boots. 6 pairs. Heavy, deliberate. They echoed off the canyon walls like war drums. Thad's head snapped up. Martha didn't have to ask. She grabbed the children and shoved them behind the stove, whispering, "Don't move, don't breathe." He stepped outside. The men weren't strangers. 3 of them were brothers of the ones he'd killed. The other 3 were hired. Hard eyes, crooked smiles, fingers twitching near pistol grips. One of them spat, "Thought you could run." Thad didn't answer, just leveled his rifle. "You shot Ken," the tallest one growled. "You think that gets washed off just 'cause you crossed a few ridges?" "You took my son," Thad replied. "You think that doesn't earn blood?" The man smiled. "It does, that's why we're here." Then the shooting started. Thad dove behind the water trough. Bullets splintered the shack walls. Martha pressed her body over the children, whispering prayers between clenched teeth. Caleb clutched her arm. Henry stared at the wall like he could will it into steel. Ruth just cried, silent tears that soaked her mother's skirt. Outside, Thad fired back. One man dropped, another screamed. But 6 against 1 was never a fair fight. A window shattered. A bullet clipped the stove, throwing sparks. Then silence. Martha dared to peek. Thad was crouched behind a barrel, bleeding from his shoulder out of ammo. The leader stepped forward, gun raised. "You got any last words, Crane?" And that's when Martha stepped out. She wasn't holding a rifle, just the Bible. But her voice was louder than any gunshot. "You boys think justice belongs to you. That vengeance makes you men. You came for blood. Fine, take mine, but you leave my children be." The men laughed. "Lady, you think words save you." "No," she said, stepping closer, her eyes blazing. "But God might." For a breath, everything paused. Then a gun cocked behind them. The old widow. She stood at the trail's edge, hands steady, eyes unblinking, shotgun raised. Behind her, 6 other townsfolk, farmers, women, one of the church deacons, all holding weapons, all quiet. "You're done," the widow said simply. The outlaws froze. The townsfolk stepped forward. The leader lowered his gun slowly. "You'd kill for them." The widow didn't blink. "No, but I'll bury you if I have to." It ended there. The men backed away. No blood that day. Just dust and the sound of retreating boots. Later, as dusk settled, Thad lay against the porch wall, arm bandaged, eyes closed. Martha sat beside him, fingers twined with his. "You think it's over?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, but we ain't alone now." She looked out over the valley, where the townsfolk had set up camp nearby, where the children were laughing again, where the wind no longer felt like teeth. "No," she agreed, "we're not." The morning came gentle for once. The sky glowed pale gold over the crooked tops of the junipers, and the mist in the valley had lifted enough for the sun to peek through. Martha sat on the splintered porch step, mending Ruth's dress with stiff fingers and soft eyes. The needle trembled once, but she steadied it, pressing her thumb to the cloth like she was reminding herself that this peace, this quiet, was real. Behind her, the shack had been patched. The stove now smoked steady. Thad lay in the back room, arm wrapped tight in a sling, his breath slow and even. Caleb had made it his mission to protect his father from sunlight and too many questions. Henry tended to the water buckets, the firewood. Ruth sang softly, humming more than she remembered the words, and twirled in the yellow light until her skirts fanned like little bird wings. They hadn't returned to their homestead, not even to bury what they'd left. Thad had said it plainly. "That land turned its back on us. We won't do the same to each other." They weren't the only ones who had fled something. In the days that followed, more souls wandered into that crumbled mining camp. A widow with a lame horse. A preacher who'd lost his church to fire. A carpenter who said nothing about the deep scar along his neck, only that he was good with his hands. No one asked too many questions. Folks brought what they could carry, seed, tools, stories, and helped nail the sagging boards of the old general store upright again. They called it Whisper Hollow, not because they meant to hide, but because it was born from what had once been too soft to be heard. Grief, regret, hope. Martha took to teaching the children. All of them, not just her own. She laid letters into dust with a stick until fingers grew confident enough to trace them. She read scripture under the canopy of pines, her voice steady even when the wind tried to steal it. The elder widow, the one who'd pointed her shotgun at death without blinking, became something like a mayor. Folks asked her before planting, before building, even before speaking hard truths. And Thad, once he'd healed, built again. Not just walls, but trust. He taught the men how to dig a root cellar that wouldn't flood, how to split timber without waste. He never spoke of the ambush or the men he'd buried in the ravine below, but every morning he laid one stone atop another at the edge of the camp. When Martha asked why, he said only, "They need remembering, even if they were wrong." Time didn't heal them so much as it softened the sharp edges. Ruth's nightmares grew quieter. Caleb laughed more, asked less about ropes and barns. Henry once stood for half an hour watching the sunrise, then said simply, "It looks like a promise." Martha didn't ask what he meant. She just pulled him into her arms. Seasons passed. Then, one late spring evening, when the creek sang louder than the birds and the sky had turned a deep honeyed rose, a stranger came riding into the hollow. He wasn't like the others, not broken, not wild-eyed. He rode straight-backed on a pale gray mare, his coat clean, boots polished. He wore no weapon, but his presence settled heavy over the camp like a held breath. Children stopped playing. Men stepped out of cabins. Martha laid down her pot and found her hands sweating. He dismounted slow, calm. "I'm looking for a family," he said, voice low but clear. "Came through the mines about half a year ago. Name of Crane, man named Thad, woman Martha, 3 kids." No one answered. Then Thad stepped forward from the tree line, an axe still resting across his shoulder, sweat streaking his brow. "What's your business?" The man didn't blink. "You don't remember me. I remember you, from way back. Used to trade with your pa. You gave me bread once when I was a boy." Thad's face didn't change. That was a long time ago. Still mattered. The man reached into his coat slowly. Every eye in the camp watched, but what he pulled out wasn't a gun. It was a folded piece of paper, a deed. He held it out. "There's land west of here. Fertile, water, trees. Mine gave out, town cleared. It's yours now. Paid for, signed." Thad didn't move. The man set the paper on a stump and stepped back. Not pity, not charity, just passing along what was given once. He turned, mounted, paused. "I hope you plant orchards there," he said. "Maybe a schoolhouse." Then he rode out without another word. For a long time, no one moved. Then Ruth picked up the paper, brought it to Martha. And Martha read it. Land. Not borrowed, not taken, given. They left the mining camp 3 days later after a sunrise service and a dozen tearful farewells. The preacher blessed their journey. The carpenter gave Henry a set of hand-carved spoons. The widow handed Martha a satchel of seeds, saying, "For when you stop running." They walked the last mile. When they crested the hill and saw the valley below, even Caleb went still. It was green. Not just patches, but rolling, wide. A creek twisted through it like silver thread. Trees stood tall. And there, right in the center, sat a small cabin, old but solid, smoke curling gentle from its chimney. Martha dropped to her knees. Thad stood beside her, hat over his heart. "This," she whispered, "this was the answer all along." They didn't rush to claim it. They walked down as if entering a church. Inside, the cabin was empty, but someone had swept the floor, laid clean linen over the table. There was bread cooling on the sill, a note beside it. "Plant deep, love deeper, a stranger." That night they slept in real beds, with full bellies. Martha stared at the ceiling and cried for all they'd lost. And then smiled for what they'd found. A home. No longer borrowed. No longer broken. Just theirs. The creek behind the ranch still ran shallow and slow in early spring, quiet enough that the children could hear their mother's voice drifting from the porch, low and sweet as she told another story to the baby curled in her arms. Caleb had built the rocker for her himself, hands too big for detail but stubborn enough to shape wood into something soft, something steady. It creaked as she swayed, the way it always did now that her days were calm and full and no longer marked by hunger or fear or the taste of boiled leather. Her eyes were tired but peaceful, like the ache of a song that had found its last verse. The sun warmed the slope beyond the barn where the three older children lay in the grass, Noah, Samuel, and Ruth, with their chins propped on elbows and their heads tilted toward the clouds. They were playing a game Caleb taught them, pointing out shapes in the sky and making up stories to match. Ruth saw a horse with wings. Noah insisted it was a bear holding a flag. Samuel said it looked like the face of God, and neither of the others argued. Caleb watched from the pasture gate, a pail in one hand and his coat still damp at the sleeves. He'd been hauling water since before dawn, same as he always did, same as he always would. There was a rhythm to it now, not just duty but something deeper, a life, rebuilt and reshaped by hands that once knew only silence and solitude. His eyes found her through the screen of dust and distance, Miriam, wrapped in a pale blue shawl she'd mended a dozen times, hair pinned back loosely, cheeks touched with wind. She smiled when she saw him looking. That smile could undo a man. The land had changed, and so had he. It wasn't the sort of place that promised much. It was dry, harsh, unforgiving when it wanted to be, but it was honest. The wind spoke truth. The fields whispered patience. And the house, standing proud on the rise above the valley, was filled now with the one thing Caleb never thought he'd hear again: laughter. It started as a whimper once, a fragile thing by the fire with bare feet and hollow bellies. Now it rang through the rafters like music. The children had grown louder, bolder. Noah took to helping with the chores, quick to shoulder weight too heavy for 10-year-old limbs but never once complaining. Samuel was slower, more thoughtful. He stayed close to Miriam, always watching, always listening. Ruth, the youngest, had become wild in the best way. She ran barefoot, climbed trees, dared storms to catch her. They were no longer shadows in rags. They were his. His, in the way a man doesn't ask for family but finds it anyway when God decides it's time. They'd come with nothing but fear in their eyes and that smell of cold ashes clinging to their skin. Now they woke with the dawn, brushed their teeth in the basin, and raced to be first at the breakfast table. There was even a bell by the porch. Caleb had hung it himself, and every morning it rang clear across the yard when Miriam called them in. Years later, strangers would ride through that valley and hear the story. A widow who fed her children with leather, a rancher who brought bread instead of pity, a family forged not by blood but by the fire of trial. And they'd ask if it was true. Miriam, if she was in the mood, might smile and say, "Mostly." But Caleb would just point to the pasture where his sons worked the fence, and his daughter rode bareback through the field, shouting at the sky like it belonged to her. And he'd say, "That's what love grows when you plant it deep enough."